This is how much rent I collect every single month on my 201 rental property.
Hello! Today we'll be talking about landlords and everything problematic with the idea of landlordism. To get the primary thesis of the video out of the way, landlords are mostly parasitical in the economic sense. People who hoard property in order to profit from the misery of inbuilt income inequality that exists and that they massively contribute to within capitalist societies. I'm not talking about individual landlords here or their moral character, just the entire institution. Furthermore, I care less about your elderly grandparents that worked their whole lives to have a single property to rent for their retirement, and more about the multi-million and billion-dollar individuals and companies that own dozens, if not hundreds and thousands of properties with basically no oversight. Historically, landlords over land got it through aristocratic privilege, politically preferential treatment for the ruling class, or outright robbery. This is the story of pretty much all large non-state-owned land, be it First World or Third. Let's share a few quotes from Adam Smith and Karl Marx on the subject of renting and landlordism in general, shall we? Landlord's right has its origin in robbery. The landlord, like all other men, loves to reap what they never sowed, and demand a rent even for the natural produce of the earth. The landlord is the one whose revenue costs them neither labor nor care, but comes to them, as it were, of its own accord, and independent of any plan or project of their own. Adam Smith even dunks on the idea that landlords justify themselves by maintaining the land that they own. The rent of land, it may be thought, is frequently no more than a reasonable profit or interest for the stock laid out by the landlord upon its improvement. This no doubt may be partly the case upon some occasions. The landlord demands, 1. A rent even for unimproved land, and the supposed interest or profit upon the expense of improvement is generally an addition to this original rent. 2. Those improvements, besides, are not always made by the stock of the landlord, but sometimes by that of the tenant. When the lease comes to be renewed, however, the landlord commonly demands the same augmentation of rent as if they had been all made by his own. 3. He sometimes demands rent for what is altogether incapable of human improvement. Now, if you'll indulge me one more quote, Marx beautifully says, "Let us now see how the landlord exploits everything from which society benefits. Every improvement in the circumstances of society tends either directly or indirectly to raise the real rent of land, to increase the real wealth of the landlord, his power of purchasing the labor or the produce of the labor of other people." In essence, according to Smith and Marx, landlords are those who love to benefit from labor they didn't do, who contribute next to nothing as a generator of revenue from their so-called investment, and are ones that benefit from society without benefiting society themselves. Now, are there any good landlords? Well, no, not really. Again, this isn't a moral argument or a commentary on the character of individual landlords, but even in the best case scenario, where you have a landlord that charges you a so-called reasonable amount, actually repairs stuff and is nice to you, there still is an imbalance in this relationship, one predicated on violence through threat of eviction, mind you. Firstly, how nice he is to you depends on your paying of the rent, and out of the money you pay, he takes a sum and uses it to repair stuff, so in all honesty, it's you paying for the repairs of someone else's property, and the so-called reasonable amount he charges doesn't change whether the mortgage on the property is paid off or not. In fact, I've never heard of a rent discount once a mortgage on a property was paid off, which should be logical for the oh-so-nice landlord. He is still sitting on and profiting from property that you could have gotten a mortgage yourself to pay, and actually live in the damn place instead of just accumulating property to rent out, but the bank deemed you too insecure of an investment to make monthly $600 payments. As a result, you pay $1,200 to a landlord, month in and month out, for your entire life, basically. Someone, or more commonly a massive corporate entity, just so happens to start off with more money than you, and as a result, you have to continuously put money into the cycle of ever-increasing income inequality despite having the long-term ability to pay off shelter that you would actually be living in. This point cannot be understated. Unless you already have money, the system is rigged against you. Sadly, or better yet predictably, capitalism turns most necessities, shelter being primary among them, into speculative assets. The housing stock is already built, the workers paid, actual homes just sitting there, but instead comes a landlord buys up several of those already existing properties and extracts profits from the most vulnerable in society. Of course, this isn't even talking about slumlords, through which quite a many seemingly respectable businessmen got their starts. Statistics and realities. This is all according to a great article titled "There is no such thing as a good landlord," linked in the pinned comment below. In the UK alone, there's a housing need of 4.7 million people. The figure in the US is over 5 million. With a need to build 340,000 new homes every year until 2031 to make up the amount. The actual number being built was only 160,000. At the same time, there are 320,000 people homeless in the UK, with almost half of those being children, and 1.15 million people on waiting lists for social housing. In the US, the official figure for homelessness is nearly 600,000 people, but the actual amount is much, much higher due to a clever sleight of hand intended to paint a more pleasant picture. What this all means is that the supply doesn't meet the demand, mouthwatering news for a prospective landlord. Less supply with a constant, if not rapidly increasing demand means property values skyrocket. A two-way street, of course, as more landlords try to buy up as much as they can chasing this golden goose, further increasing property prices. People already renting see the potential of ever owning their own property drifting farther and farther away as housing stock depletes and becomes increasingly more expensive, with the average house price being 8 times the UK average wage, and as high as 14 times that in London. The figure is only slightly better, at 7 times the average US yearly salary in the United States. In the UK, if you don't earn the equivalent of $83,000 a year, or nearly $140,000 a year in London, then it will be virtually impossible for you to ever own your own place. In the US, to afford the average house price of $374,000 via mortgage, you would need a minimum income of $105,000 per year, for many a virtual impossibility. You either rent or you're on the streets. Thus, you have no choice but to rent and pay whatever price desired by the landlord, as shelter's kinda non-negotiable. This isn't even speaking of the lack of options those homeless have, of which thousands die every year during the winter. After all, those homeless and the high likelihood of disease or death are the threat landlords use to force renters to accept ridiculous asking amounts for, in many cases, old, unrenovated, poorly heated, and spatially restrictive homes. The system is fundamentally weighed in favor of landlords, with the average one making more than twice the average national salary within the UK. The US has muddier stats, but the number falls between 1.5 to 3 times the average national salary depending on how you measure it. Even if there's a downturn in the market and rent goes lower, they still have a property, an asset, something with the potential to appreciate the second the market bounces back. This is the story pretty much everywhere. Most people spend about 25% of their monthly income on rent, and in some places this number can be as high as 30, 40, 60% or even higher of your monthly income. And the beauty is you can't do anything about it because usually all the good jobs are in large cities with already bloated renting or property markets. Fundamentally, landlords both create and profit from the existence of poverty and homelessness. In all essence, rent is a tax placed by the better off in society on usually the poorest in society for daring to be poor and want to live somewhere habitable. Landlords are superfluous. It's absentee ownership. Landlords earn money from tenants due to property rights, not their labor. Landlords make their money while sleeping, eating, or just existing while you go to work every single day. All while not living there and being able to charge you however much they want and dictate terms on how you live in your own home, which isn't really your own home. As with every argument in the support of capitalism, choice is equated with an ultimatum. They take the money you pay them to pay off the property and then take a little extra as profit. Everything a landlord does or pays for comes from your wallet, be it property tax, maintenance, or whatever else. If the landlord didn't exist, then the tenant would pay less overall. Landlords are unnecessary middlemen that profit off of poverty and homelessness. There is no skill required to buy housing, with the only requirement being money or access to finance. To notice that there is a need in a community for housing is to notice that people need food, meaning a completely ridiculous thing to stake your right to hoard housing to. To quote the Greater Manchester Housing Action, a landlord might argue that they possess a skill in predicting in advance when a residential area will gentrify, and then use their skill to invest shrewdly in such areas to bring themselves greater profit margins. Such a skill is of no benefit to society, so it's unclear why it warrants financial reward. Minimal bravery is required to invest in a rental property. In the unlikely event a landlord fails to find some desperate soul to rent their purchase to, they still have a capital asset that is likely to have appreciated in value. The administrative burden of being a landlord is minimal when compared with running a cotton mill or a curry house. Relevant examples from earlier in the article. Arranging viewings, having to occasionally call a plumber, supplying annual gas safety certificates, etc. are not arduous tasks. Despite this, many landlords either fail to fulfill their small role adequately or subcontract to a letting agent who is usually effectively paid by the renter through further inflated rent. By the time a landlord takes ownership of a home, the home already exists. The workers involved in the hard work of physical construction give society its housing stock and the renter their shelter, not the landlord. Our housing stock has already been paid for. That we continue to pay for it again and again in perpetuity is a form of collective madness. The problem is systemic. It's not the individual landlords that are the problem, it's the existence of the landlord layer of society that is. The existence of this entire group that own housing for whatever reason and leaves the rest unable to do the same unless they pay a monthly fee to use said housing that the landlord just has and doesn't use is a societal issue, regardless of whether the person you're renting from is a good or bad person. A potential solution and conclusion. I did not intend for that to rhyme. The obvious solution is socialism, with publicly owned housing for all. Pretty much every single socialist country, both historically as well as today, had either eliminated homelessness or have negligent amounts, especially compared to the behemoth homeless populations of the US, UK, and rest of the so-called prosperous Western capitalist democracies. I've spoken extensively on socialism elsewhere, and concrete steps can only be taken through direct action, organization building, and agitation. To quote an interesting idea termed the people's rented sector from the same Manchester source earlier, if we broke away from landlordism, our housing costs would be limited to the cost of keeping our homes in a good state of repair and fit for human habitation, alongside a small contribution to the cost of continually replenishing the nation's housing stock. For most renters, this would represent a life-changing reduction in housing costs. We would then all have the choice to either use the money saved on things that actually bring us happiness, or cut our working hours, giving us more leisure time to do things that bring us happiness. And we would do so living without fear of homelessness. The overall benefit to society would be immense. Interesting, in my opinion, as one prong of a multifaceted political approach towards housing when working within the capitalist system. However, the only concrete and permanent change will come with the overthrow of the capitalist system and the construction of socialism. And with that said, that's all for this time. I'll probably make another video going through all the crappy arguments landlords use to justify their existence later in the month. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Thomas, Guillaume Legault, Mading Dong Tildo, Mariar Keshavars, Ashley, Fino Punke, Elent, BJ Dripley, Professor G, Katie Marshall, Gail Whitetail, Razi, Robert French, Robert Milton, Whackjack, Joseline Esperanza Dvorzina Sonder, Sam, Isaac Montalvo, A Skeleton, Carrie Hoffmeister, Amanda Manod, Jeremy Winter, Chris, Kelsey Kallstrom, Theodore Gilbert, Tip Tap Wobble, Barry Shields, Aaron J., Matt C., Jonathan Delahaye, Umut, Noah Walls, Stuart Frank, and Christian Butterworth. Thanks for watching.